What even is nougat, and why is it in so many things? It's a primary component in nearly every candy bar, up there with caramel, chocolate, nuts, but I know what those things are. WTF is nougat?
Basically, it's an aerated confection where the air is stabilized by some kind of protein, and the continuous phase is basically a sugar syrup.
That's Dr. Richard Hartel, professor of food engineering at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and continuous phase in this context basically just means the main structure of the thing. In chocolate, the continuous phase is fat, cocoa butter, a web of fat molecules with little bits of cocoa solids and sugars hanging inside that web. Those are the dispersed phases. In nougat,
the dispersed phase is air, and the continuous phase, which holds that air, is a sugar matrix.
And within that, there's a web of proteins surrounding the air bubbles. The protein is what makes this whipped sugar syrup stable, solid, and stretchy or bouncy. So that makes sense. But here's the thing. An aerated sugar syrup stabilized with protein describes a lot of different confections. Not just nougat, but meringue, marshmallow, a popular one here in the American South called divinity. What makes a nougat different? Well, Dr. Hartel says it comes down to 4 big variables: the air content, the water content, the kind of sugar being used, and the kind of protein being used. We'll work ourselves back through that list. Nougat is usually made with egg and sometimes soy protein. Marshmallow often has some of those as well, but it usually also has gelatin, which is a protein boiled out of animal parts.
And gelatin has a texture when it's surrounding air bubbles like that that's a real squishy, elastic texture. So you push down on a jet puffed marshmallow, it bounces back. If you push down on a nougat, generally it stays where you left it because you've broken that structure.
Okay, but why, right? Why is gelatin bouncy?
It's the nature of the junction zones as they form a gel. It's just a series of amino acids like any protein is, but its secondary and tertiary structure are such that when it forms a gel, it forms these really complicated helices at the junction zones, and those are, like springs, have some elasticity to it.
In contrast, albumin and globulin form much simpler networks that just don't do that. And albumin and globulin are the proteins in eggs and soy, respectively. And it's usually eggs being used in nougat. But albumin is also the protein used in this stuff, marshmallow fluff. There's no gelatin in this, just eggs. Why is this marshmallow and not nougat? Well, I think we need to see some nougat being made. Let us don our Mr. Rogers cardigans and our hairnets and get a little factory tour. This is Crown Candy, a mid-sized confectionery where I live in Macon, Georgia, that has been operating for literally 100 years. They make old-timey nostalgia-type candies under various brand names. Yes, that's nougat for their log rolls. It's so sticky that they can't handle it with gloves. They're constantly dipping their hands in sanitized water as they work it. The vice president of production here at Crown Candy is my buddy, Jamie Weatherford.
The liquids will go up top in the kettle. The solids will be in the bottom kettle. They get pre-mixed, and then you cook your liquid to a particular temperature, remove any moisture to the amount that you want, and then you drop it into your solids and mix it up.
The stuff in the lower bowl is basically what you would mix together here in the kitchen to get a meringue going. Whipped egg whites with some sugar to stabilize the bubbles. In the factory, they're combining water with some dried egg albumin, a combination of different sugars like fructose and corn syrup, and this stuff, frappe or frappe. It's a pre-whipped sugar and egg mixture that they use to kind of get the aeration process started. All that gets fluffed up, and then the hot syrup comes down and gets whipped in gradually. This slowly cooks the nougat.
We're bringing it over here onto this tables. We give them an opportunity to cool down, and then we place them in an extruder, and then we have a guillotine that comes in and breaks the log. It comes out in one string, and then it breaks it.
Brutal. You might say, let them eat nougat. In this case, nougat coated in caramel and nuts. Lovely. Then the logs go into a climate-controlled room to cure or dry out for a little bit. And this gets us to the second of the 4 big variables that make nougat nougat and not something else, and that is water content. It's pretty intuitive. The more water a confection has, the softer it's generally going to be. Hence, marshmallow fluff, or in this case, Italian meringue, which is just homemade marshmallow fluff. Again, there's no gelatin in this. It's just hot syrup drizzled into an egg foam, just like nougat. So why don't we call it nougat? Well, I think it's just because it has way more water. In candy making, the way that you control the water content is by boiling your syrup up to a certain temperature. Syrup physically can't reach certain temperatures until it's boiled off a certain amount of its water. That's why it doesn't really matter how much water you put into your sugar when you start, because you're going to boil it out until you hit your target temperature, which for Italian meringue is about 240 Fahrenheit, 115 C. That's low as candy making goes, so there's still a lot of water left in here, which is why the resulting product is soft and spreadable. I think the softer, bouncier texture of this reminds people more of marshmallow than of nougat, so that's why some people, including myself, call it marshmallow, even though it has no gelatin. When they make nougat at Crown Candy, they boil it up to 270 Fahrenheit or 132 C. That's pretty hot as far as these things go, so the resulting product is much more firm. Indeed, the texture of a confection is so sensitive to tiny variations in water content that Jamie literally has to check the weather before he comes to work every day. Sugar is hydroscopic, meaning it'll kind of suck water straight out of the air, and it gets super swampy down here in Macon, Georgia.
For instance, if I know it's going to be a bright, sunshiny summer day, I may cook our log centers to 269 degrees. But if I know it's going to be a very humid, kind of muggy summer week, I may increase the temperature to 272.
He's got to cook more water off to account for the water the candy is going to suck in from the air. Water content also explains why, say, a meringue cookie is not nougat. It's baked in the oven until virtually all the water is driven out of the outer crust, making it crunchy instead of fluffy or chewy. Water content is also the main difference between nougat and divinity, which is a classic Southern grandma treat. The syrup for divinity is cooked to more like 250 Fahrenheit, 120 C, so there's more water and it's a softer product. So that all explains why nougat is not other things. But why is nougat not like nougat? This is nougat, and this is nougat. Totally different textures, all nougat. We shall find out why that is the case right after I thank the sponsor of this video, HelloFresh, America's #1 meal kit. Lordy, I need some vegetables after eating all that sugar, so I'm going to go with the vegetarian meal plan this time. HelloFresh has meaty meal plans too, of course, but even though I do eat meat, I have found the veggie plan really helps me to think more creatively about plant-based meals, and these were totally delicious and satisfying. I'm trying to eat less meat. HelloFresh spares you the stress of meal planning and going out to the store. Everything arrives pre-portioned, and that pre-portioning minimizes food waste, which makes this surprisingly environmentally friendly. The packaging, too, is almost entirely recycled or recyclable, and the plans are flexible. You decide you want to get back on the meat train, you can. You decide you want to skip a week's delivery, you can, whenever you want. It's easy. Use my code AdamRagusea60 to get $60 off your first 3 weeks, including free shipping on your first box with purchase. Go to HelloFresh.com to redeem and for more details. $60 off with AdamRagusea60. That's all down in the description. Thank you, HelloFresh. Now, how are both of these products considered nougat when they're so radically different from each other? Well, Dr. Hartel says it comes down to the third of the 4 variables we're discussing, which is the kind of sugar being used and the state of the sugar. The sugar in a Three Musketeers, for example, is partially crystalline.
So when you break Three Musketeers and pull it apart, the nougat breaks clean. Whereas if you tried to pull a chewy nougat, and a good example of a chewy nougat in the U.S. is a Charleston chew, and if you were to pull that apart, you would get a longer stretch. So the sugar crystals actually break up the sugar syrup and the stretchiness of that sugar syrup and give it a very different mouthfeel. So a Charleston chew, you chew and you chew and you chew, it sticks to your teeth, you keep chewing, it's good movie food.
And how do candy makers achieve this? By changing the ratio of the sugars, usually cane sugar and corn syrup. Some fancy candies use honey instead of corn syrup because honey is way more expensive, but on the molecular level, the concept is the same. Sucrose versus some other kind of sugar, glucose, for example, though corn syrup can have lots of different kinds of sugar in it. What matters is that it's not sucrose. Corn syrup is what they amusingly call a doctor in the candy making industry. A doctoring agent inhibits the formation of sugar crystals. It's a molecule that gets in between the sucrose molecules and prevents them from linking up and forming a solid, a crystal. The more crystallized the nougat is, the more brittle or short the texture is. The fewer crystals you have, the chewier it is. Candy makers, of course, try to keep their recipes as secret as possible, but here in the States, the law says they have to list their ingredients in order of proportionality. So we can tell from the label that the Three Musketeers has more sugar than corn syrup, while the Charleston Chew has more corn syrup than sugar, which is exactly what we'd expect going by their textures. Marshmallow Fluff has more corn syrup than you'd see in a typical homemade homemade Italian meringue recipe. I suspect this helps with shelf life by inhibiting crystallization. You can also stop a crystal from forming by inverting the sugar, that is, breaking sucrose down into a monosaccharide, which can be done with heat or acid. That's why some confection recipes call for cream of tartar to break down some of the sugars and inhibit crystallization. Also, the size of the crystals matters. A Three Musketeers bar has lots of very small crystals in it. Dr. Hartel says one way to achieve this is by adding powdered sugar to nougat as what they'd call seed crystals.
So when we do that in the lab, we pour the last thing we add is the powdered sugar, make sure it's uniformly mixed, and then pour that onto a slab. And if you tasted it then, it's got a little bit of short texture to it, but it's the next day, then it becomes really short like a Three Musketeer.
As any elementary school science student can tell you, it takes time for crystals to grow. Now, the fourth and final thing that makes this different from this is the amount of air that you whip in.
Big difference between marshmallow, which has a really low density, somewhere down around 0.3, 0.4 for a jet puff marshmallow, versus a nougat, which is probably closer to 0.9 to 1. And so it's much, much more dense. And so you can also change the texture of nougat by changing the aeration level.
Air also helps to explain the mystery that you've probably been contemplating this entire time, which is why is nougat in everything?
You know, one of the kind of mantras of the food industry is that the more air you can sell, the more money you make.
Air is free, and nougat is full of air. Free bulk for your product.
So I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, you know, and I had whatever, a quarter, what was the candy bar that I wanted most? The biggest candy bar. And so I always picked a Three Musketeers because it was the biggest thing.
I'm right there with you, Doc, though this is still one of my favorite candy bars to this day. I love that light, fluffy texture. So, what have we learned here? Well, I think it's that candy making is a lot like bread making. Bread is all just different combinations of some flour and some water and some yeast and some salt. And through very subtle differences in the type of ingredient and the proportions and the process, you get a world, a whole universe of different breads. It's kind of the same thing with confections. Subtle variations of protein, sugar, water, and air give you a whole universe of different nougats for you to try. Get out there and get one that speaks to you. Of the four big variables that make